Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jeff Berenger. I'm a member of the Consumer Financial Services practice here at McGlinchey, Stafford, and resident in the Albany office. I'm going to moderate a panel this afternoon consisting of three individuals that have government affairs practices. Um, First, Kevin Bronner. He serves as vice president at Park Strategies, where he specializes in helping clients navigate New York state and local government budget, legislative procurement, and regulatory processes. Next is Ronnie Johnson, who is a member of McGlinchey Stafford's government relations and insurance regulatory practices, and he's resident in our Baton Rouge and Dallas offices. And then last but not least is Jason Redmond of our New Orleans and Baton Rouge office, and he's a government relations specialist or lobbyist. Um, so our topic today is uh, legislatures and regulators reacting to COVID-19. Rather than discussing in granular detail uh, how state regulators and legislatures have responded to COVID-19, we thought it would be more interesting to have a panel of how our clients and colleagues and things that government relations practitioners do in response to legislative and regulatory developments, and how they work with industry in helping navigate the legislative and regulatory process in connection with COVID-19 generally, and then also in connection with similar emergencies that may come up in the future. Um, so to put it in context, on March 19th, 2020, Governor Cuomo here in New York had a press conference, and he noted that he was canceling mortgage payments for 90 days. And that left industry scrambling to identify what that meant and whether or not he could do that, and left a lot of questions unresolved. Since that time, there's been no fewer than 68 executive orders here in New York responding to COVID-19. There's been foreclosure moratoria, eviction moratoria, and they've been continuously extended. There's been administrative orders from the court system, and then attorney general letters were sent to several large servicers identifying expected responses in response to COVID, as well as DFS letters urging foreclosure and forbearances, regulations addressing forbearances, and they culminated in June with the legislature passing what's codified as Banking Law 9X, which requires covered entities to make applications for forbearances readily available, requires that forbearances be granted for 180 days with an option to extend for an additional 180 days for non-CARES Act mortgages. And then at the end, dictates the long-term loss mitigation relief that needs to be provided to consumers at the end of the up to 1 year forbearance. And then compliance with that requirement is a prerequisite to foreclosure. So New York's an example of a state that's been pretty active in responding to COVID-19. Other states that come to mind that have been active are California, Oregon, and DC. Whereas where Jason and Ronnie practice in Louisiana, they've been a bit lighter. The OFI issued guidance, quote unquote, urging licensees to provide CARES Act relief for non-CARES Act loans. And there was a suspension of in-person court proceedings, but compared to New York and some of the other jurisdictions, Louisiana has been kind of light. So with that backdrop, I wanted to, see if first Kevin and then Ronnie and Jason can provide a brief summary of the political and regulatory environment in their given state, to lay out the picture as to why some states, using New York as an example, are very active in the space compared to a state like Louisiana, where maybe not as active. So I'll let Kevin go first, and he can address that question.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you for having me. New York definitely has a challenging regulatory and legislative environment in normal times. And this year's, extraordinary environment where we saw things that, um, that we never thought we would be seeing a year ago. With respect to the political environment, for a long time in New York, we've had a balanced government. The governors tended to be more Democratic, other than a brief 12-year period, but the legislature has been split with a Republican-controlled Senate and a Democratic-controlled Assembly. With the Assembly was mainly more urban, downstate focused. The state Senate was more suburban, we call upstate New York, Western New York, Central New York, more rural, and let's say almost like more Midwestern feel. Upstate Western New York has more Midwestern feel. So that changed in 2018 after the midterm. We saw, we saw starting in 18 with the election of AOC, who all know who she is, the congresswoman who in New York. She won a primary, and it really catapulted a more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which took out numerous incumbents, including a block of moderate Democrats who caucused with sort of caucus. They formed a coalition with the Senate Republicans, and that backstop that would protect a lot of the legislation we would be able to see from moving through is now gone. And so the past 2 years have been real. We've seen a real progressive shift with respect to many of the policies, including banking, financial services. And we expect that to continue as we had primaries in June of this year, which saw what self-described Democratic Socialist of America in New York City take out 5 long-term Democratic incumbents. So it's really, the legislative environment is really becoming more challenging from a business perspective in terms of the type of policy, right, legislation we're going to see moving through. With respect to the executive and the regulatory front, our governor has extraordinary powers right now via a law that was passed in March 2020 due to the COVID-19 emergency. It allows the governor to suspend or modify almost all laws, and the governor has taken heart with that and utilized it, and he continues to take action and pass policy via executive order. That law is in effect until March of 2021, unless the legislature rescinds it. We don't see the legislature doing it at this time due to the politics of COVID-19, and we're seeing some hot spots pop up around New York City. So the governor is trying to address a myriad of issues due to COVID. One of them, as Jeff mentioned, was mortgage forbearance. But there's other things that are starting to arise on the financial services side, to be more specific to this audience, such as credit with respect to scoring of underwriting of insurance, looking at it for banking. Life insurance was brought up because because COVID was attacking, was really hurting people of a certain income class that couldn't be approved for life insurance. They're looking at things such as that. And we have a regulator who's the Department of Financial Services, who's very, very close to the governor, longtime ally, and she has more of a political bent as well. So to her actions. So it's a challenging environment, to say the least. But we continue to monitor for our clients, get them in front of, try to get them in front of the decision makers and policymakers to find out what's going on, to get answers to executive orders that sometimes come as a surprise. and best position them to shape the environment in New York. So.
Thank you. And then Jason or Ronnie, you commented on the kind of like the parallel in the legislative and political environment and regulatory environment in
Sure.
Louisiana.
Well, if you, Jason, if it's all right with you, I'll do a high level for Louisiana, touch briefly on Texas, and then I'll let you fill in the more of the detail for Louisiana. Governor John Bell Edwards, the governor of Louisiana, declared a public health emergency. In accordance with that emergency finding, he issued a number of proclamations. He gave the Department of Health and Hospitals certain privileges and exemptions from certain statutes. He did the same with respect to the Commissioner of Insurance. In Louisiana, the Commissioner of Insurance is an elected position. It's not an appointed position. The commissioner, even though the Office of Financial Institutions, who is an appointee of the governor, took a very laid back approach to how to handle COVID and the consequences arising from COVID. The Commissioner of Insurance was much more active. He issued a series of emergency orders, some of which suspended the force and effect of various notices that insurers sent, such as a notice of non-renewal, notice of cancellation, notice of non-reinstatement. Any one of those types of notices that was sent prior to the effective period of the emergency rule were declared to be null and void and cannot be sent until after the expiration of the emergency rule. The emergency rule has since expired. There was special recognition that many people use premium financing to acquire their insurance policy, especially in Louisiana, because we have a disproportionately poor population and we have very high automobile insurance rates. In the case of if a policy was premium financed, the commissioner allowed the premium finance company to send notice of cancellation on behalf of the insurer during the effective period of the emergency rule, but the insurer could not actually cancel the policy until after the emergency rule terminated by its provisions. I'm going to shift gears slightly to Texas. Texas, our legislature only meets every other year. We're scheduled to meet in Texas starting on the second Tuesday of January. They meet, that's the start date for each legislative session. This will be the 87th session, and it's always the second Tuesday in January of an odd numbered year. And they can meet up to 148 days. So they've not met really during this period of time. We don't know. I mean, there's so many logistical issues about how do you meet. There's certain requirements that the public be able to attend and participate in the process. The concern is that all of those who are stakeholders may not be able to get a quote seat at the table. And again, we don't know how to really deal with that. I'm sure they're looking at next door to Louisiana. Louisiana, one of the governor's aides and one of the members of the legislature were diagnosed, having had COVID and died. Many of the members of the legislature were diagnosed, had positive test results. But when you actually see people in your ranks die from this horrible virus, it really sends, a message to the others in the process. Do we really want to be meeting? How close do we want to meet? What precautions do we want to take? Do we want to subject ourselves to being, open to the population? And right now in Louisiana, we have one of our U.S. senators and some congressmen who are up for re-election, and Senator Cassidy, who's one of our two U.S. senators. I don't know how many people know this, but he was recently diagnosed with COVID, had to take a break from his campaign until he got back, recovered from it. He's since recovered, but it's really affected the politics a lot. Now, having said that, I know Jason has a lot of the details, and I will defer to him to provide more of the details.
Thank you, Ron. Yeah, well, as a lot of y'all may already think, Louisiana is different. We do a lot of things differently down here. We're probably, in terms of political alignment, we're probably we were probably one of the last southern states to really become a solid conservative Republican majority state. Although counter to that, we currently have a Democratic governor who just got reelected to a second term. And in terms of elections being different, unlike other states where they do an executive election in one even numbered year and then midterms where the staggered terms provide a check and balance, we do all our legislative elections and gubernatorial and statewide elected officials all at once the same year. And that happened to be last year, 2019. And Governor Edwards, who gotten elected the first time, let's just say the quality of his opponent in 2015 was not great. That's seen as a big reason why he was elected in a otherwise very solid Republican state. Well, last year he ran for re-election, and the president was down here campaigning for his opponent, and you could chalk it up to a lot of reasons, but he managed to get reelected to a second term. But at the same time, in terms of the legislative alignment, for years it was a very solid Democratic majority, and like a lot of southern states, but slowly and surely, and in our case too, mainly because of party switches, the majorities in the House and Senate gradually became Republican majorities just on the virtue of party switches. So we went into this new term with the last term we went in with numerical majorities, Republican majorities in both the House and the Senate. But then we had another phenomenon occur last year where we passed term limits a long time ago, about 20 something years ago. This last election was the first term where we had a 40% turnover in the legislature, let's put it that way, because a lot of the guys, the term limits were kicking in for a lot of the folks who have been there a really long time. So we got a brand new crop of younger ideological firebrands, if you want to say that, who so the nationalization of the Louisiana legislature, as it's been put, has been trending very strongly. Like in the past, we hadn't had like majority leaders or minority leaders officially, like in an institutional sense, but that's all starting to change. So having said all that, as it relates to COVID, just to give you an overview, as of yesterday, we have 168,000 confirmed cases, 5,300 confirmed deaths, and nearly 2.4 million confirmed tests. Now, obviously, you heard a lot early on in the crisis that a big driver in Louisiana of COVID was Mardi Gras, which clearly when you have people coming from around the world partying in very close quarters, that was not a shock to anybody. So COVID really sprung from the New Orleans area and worked its way, and we saw the maps every day, which is growing every day centered out of New Orleans. So that's kind of where we're at now in terms of statistics. In terms of as you put it, have we had a lighter response compared to New York or other states? It could be said. That doesn't mean the political controversies that have arisen out of all that are any less. In fact, in some cases, there might be more given the makeup I just described. So basically, to give you a quick overview, the governor issued a public health emergency first on March 11th, which then in March 22nd, he issued the first stay-at-home orders, which lasted all the way through May 15th, where he moved this into phase 1. In June, we moved to phase 2. September, we moved to phase 3. He did issue a mask mandate on July 11th. So that's kind of where we stand right now in terms of executive orders. Now, I guess it could be said that a lot of our response is being piggybacked on what the federal response is. We're basically just trying to fill in fill in gaps where the CARES Act and whatnot, the areas that are not addressed there, the state legislature and the governor are trying to address those issues, either through executive order or legislation. The immediate now, when the COVID hit, the legislature was already starting a regular legislative session, which they quickly had to shut down. So a lot of the, we have a long 3-month regular session every other year, although we have one every year, but this one was sort of our mega session. So a lot of the normal issues that legislators like to take care of were not taken care of. And there was a lot of uncertainty as to when the legislature was coming back. They did come back in the summer for a first special session that was called by the legislature, not the governor. That's a break from tradition as well. Again, showing the legislature's independence.
Can I cut you off there? Because I have a question about
Sure.
the special session. And as Kevin alluded to, we're starting to see cases crop up here in New York again. And unfortunately, it seems that the response to COVID, just because of the fact that it appears that it's not necessarily under control, at least in the eyes of policymakers, is going to need to continue. So in connection with the special session, and then I guess I'm going to go to Kevin too for his input, but do you see increased or more financial services or insurance related responses coming either out of the legislature or executive order down the road? And then if so, can you comment on strategies that worked best in the past legislative executive session, the past couple of months, that have worked as industries helping to respond to those items, and then what may be effective either in any special session that occurs in the future, or the next legislative session that's going to start up after the year. And so I will give that to Kevin first, then we'll return to Jason and Ronnie on that.
Okay, so our legislature, similar to what Jason spoke about, they were in session too when this hit in March. Actually, we're in the middle of our budget process, and our budget passed April 1st. To the extent you can even do a budget when the economy's shut down like that, you don't know what the revenues are. So they went home April 1st after passing that budget, which was, they claimed was balanced, but we all knew was not balanced. As a result of that dynamic, the governor was given additional powers by the legislature to reduce the size of the budget should the governor feel necessary, via a resolution. And then if he did that, then the legislature had 10 days to act. That has since not happened. The governor's just cash managed the scenario, not paying certain vendors, reducing payments out by a percentage. So there's been a widely talked about 20% reduction in what is called aid to localities, which is money goes to school districts, cities, not-for-profits, economic development projects, whatever else is in that category. The legislature did come back. We actually had 3 special sessions. We had one immediately in June to address COVID issues specifically. Those dealt with everything from the 9X mortgage forbearance that Jeff spoke about to, there's things that do with public utilities, there's labor laws, the such. And then they came back again at the end of June to address civil justice issues due to the civil unrest issues that happened in June. They then went home, and then came back in July, did another round of bills. This was your traditional end of session, and where they pass extenders or some policy that had nothing to do with COVID. It was actually refreshing that it was kind of seemed like normal to us in end of session, even though it was in the middle of July. Usually happens in June. and then they since have been home. So going forward now, we're all waiting for, what Washington is going to do in terms of additional monies for state and local governments. We're yeah, from, the financial services side, the focus really is what's going to happen with that. If nothing happens and we have to close we're told is a $14 billion budget hole, we know taxes are on the table. So we're waiting. That's really what we're trying to get handle on. You have your traditional corporate tax, um, corporate tax, income tax, but there's also sorts of data taxes that are floating around, which we're finding impact many of our financial service clients in ways that we didn't expect. So we're monitoring that. If they do come back to a special session for COVID, like financial issues such as that, we would probably be after the election. From a regulatory standpoint, the governor continues to put out emergency orders. DFS has been pretty active, although it has slowed down. These mortgage forbearance issues could, they could be extended. We're finding two fronts where there's pressure is with the mortgage forbearance, A, and B, with the rent. The federal government issued a rent moratorium, but New York has a rent moratorium as well. And for those who aren't familiar, New York has really aggressive advocacy groups for rent due to New York City, the cost of living in New York City. It's a constant battle between the landlords and the tenants. I'm sure it's that way everywhere, but New York City, from what I'm told, is extra aggressive in this space. So we're following that because it flows down where, the renter isn't paying the landlord then isn't paying the mortgage, and in some instances they're not paying the taxes. So we're monitoring that. I think when our session returns in January, we will see more aggressive actions to deal with COVID. And there's a lot of, we'll discuss this later, but there's a lot being looked at on the insurance side too, specifically business interruption insurance. There's a lot of pressure there to help out restaurants and entities that are still closed. So.
And then Jason and Ronnie, I'll ask this question to both of you is, when there's an emergency, whether it's COVID or fires or flooding, and then there's a legislative and regulatory response, can you kind of comment on the strategies that you use with your clients in addressing those issues in Louisiana?
Yeah, certainly. One thing, Jason, I do want to point out, if you don't mind, that's going on in the current special session is because of political blowback of the governor shutting down businesses, and the owners of the bars are really up in arms because they feel like they should be able to reopen and make a living. So it's the governor's exercise of emergency powers is being called into question, and there's legislation that may seek to restrict what the governor may or may not do in times of an emergency. That has the Commissioner of Insurance deeply concerned because he's depending upon, or generally depending upon, the governor to transfer certain authority to him to suspend certain laws and rules so that he can act in case of an emergency. COVID, as I expressed earlier, had a limited, the commissioner issued a series of emergency orders. The governor had a series of proclamations. Most of the emergency orders that the Commissioner of Insurance issued have ceased to exist with respect to COVID. But unfortunately, Louisiana this year has been a target of almost every named storm you can imagine. Right now, there's another hurricane out in the Gulf that's headed straight to Louisiana. I think this will be the fourth one this year to hit Louisiana or to affect Louisiana. And in response to each one of these, the commissioners issued emergency rules. So, he's deeply concerned if he loses that ability. So there's legislation that I have not yet seen, but I have been told that would be introduced to give him certain authority independent of the governor. But a state of emergency is declared, of course, representing the insurance industry. we are very concerned about what that legislation may or may not say. So until we see a draft, we can't comment on it, but it is something that has got a number of my clients keenly watching everything that's going on. And then with respect to the second part of your question, I'm sorry, what was the second part?
Yeah, essentially strategies that that are employed by you and your colleagues, in terms of addressing legislative response to an emergency.
Wow. We have all sorts of clients that have all sorts of issues, whether it be issues with the executive branch, local government, or the legislative branch. We try to identify, all put our arms around the scope of the issue on behalf of the client. And then we try to think out of the box, how can we resolve this and benefit our client and add the most value? So there's not really a consistent approach, and every approach we take is pretty tailor-made for that client. But obviously, we're there on behalf of insurers who are seeking all sorts of relief, or because of the losses occasioned by COVID in the investment portfolios, and then you get hit with the storms, and then reinsurers are going up on the rates. There's certain industries that have certain weakness in terms of financials. We're trying to work with regulators to get relief where we can. Some insurers want to either non-renew books of business, sell books of business. I've been actively trying to help insurers that have a book of business that they don't want to maintain, introduce them to another insurer who will assume that business. So we've got all sorts of things going on there. Lenders are very much concerned about, their portfolios, whether, borrowers will continue to be able to make their payments. And so there's all sorts of issues there that we're addressing. We within the firm, we have a team that does workouts. So, we work cohesively and as part of a larger team to try to meet the needs of the clients. Now, Jason, hopefully I left you enough room to get a few words in there.
Oh, absolutely. No, and I was just going to interject at the beginning that, yeah, we have plenty of experience with emergency situations between hurricanes and floods. And of course, this is a bit different. And that's why some of the interactions between the legislature and the governor have been different than in traditional emergencies, if you want to call it that way. I'll just give you a small example of what Ronnie was just talking about. One of our clients was a bar in New Orleans. And it's one of these situations where they are a bar, they established themselves as a bar, but they also developed a small, what they call a kitchen operation. And over time that it sort of built up to where they're making a pretty good revenue stream off the kitchen operation. Problem was they're not licensed as a restaurant, technically. So when the executive order came out, it was very specific. All bars are closed. Although, so the bars were closed, our client was closed, had to be closed, but you had people who were licensed as restaurants still being able to do delivery and curbside service, and at the same time sell alcohol in certain circumstances. So obviously it was, like, how is this fair? Well, we went, in that case, that's not, your first reaction there is not a legislative solution right off the bat, but we did reach out to the executive authorities who regulate those aspects of the executive order. And unfortunately, it was kind of a black and white situation there. Either if it's fish or fowl, you're a restaurant or you're a bar. But that's an example that small example there, how you just have your strategy is based on the circumstances of the issue and the client involved and the personalities involved. Because if it gets to a point where it's a legislative solution, you have to deal with, in our case, 139 personalities who may or may not have different views on the issue you're dealing with. So,
yeah, that touches on something that I know Kevin and I were texting as the legislature was responding to COVID earlier in the year. But how much of the policy decisions are being made behind closed doors, like in New York and in other jurisdictions where prior engagement with folks like Kevin and Jason and Ronnie each of you, is important so that industry knows what is coming, as opposed to discussions with me where I'm interpreting the law and helping them react. And can you kind of comment on how the sausage is made in this scenario in New York, and the importance of industry engagement through the years and not just in response to legislation and regulatory action?
In New York, quite often legislation is done behind closed doors, and the way we find out about it is the bill's introduced, or we're given a heads up by legislative staff. So that's where your relationships and the network you have really come into play. So where I work, we have a team of 20 people. We're constantly talking and sharing information. We're all reaching out to our contacts. But even then, it's challenging from the financial services side, because many of the members in the legislature they're not fans of the industry. They are fans of consumer advocacy groups. So sometimes legislation will just pop up and you can just tell it was written by some advocacy group. And you have to go in and then educate the legislators who introduce it. You have to advocate, educate the chairman of the committees, leadership, the staff. Then you're reaching out to the executive level to try to point out to them, to have them push back, and hope that you can either stop the legislation because you make the public policy argument as to why it's bad. In New York, it's really effective to point out, while you think you're helping consumers, this is going to actually hurt more consumers. And we found that to be successful when we have those discussions. Sometimes it's just the politics are too much, and then it'll pass anyway. But we engage in direct advocacy with these folks. We try to amend the legislation. We offer amendments. We have meetings with our clients to explain the situation. Sometimes we get so granular that if you as Ronnie alluded to, there's no one bold approach here. We have clients that have employees and districts that we can utilize to start issuing pressure points on certain legislators. Sometimes there's a press strategy that needs to be done to influence legislators. And so the sausage is generally made behind the scenes, and it's negotiated quite often in the middle of the night. And the hope is that our contacts and relationships are strong enough to get heads up and try to influence the process. I find, from my point of view, and this is just how I lobby, is I'm lobbying all night long. Part of that is like where I came out of. I know everything's done at night, and I know people are actually more available at night because you don't have 100 meetings during the day of people like me in your offices and wanting to meet with advocacy groups. So actually, I find a lot at night. While there's a lot of negotiation going on, you can get in touch with a lot of these folks and try to influence the legislation. And the same thing with the executive. I mean, you just want to get in front of these issues and go touch base with policymakers, letting them know, where your client is, the concerns they have on certain issues. And to the extent you don't have a heads up, it can become a fire drill. You got to get in there right away. But I mean, at the end of the day, there are the policymakers make policy, not so much, industry. We're just a constituency trying to influence the policy from the outside. So.
And then in terms of policy arguments, and then I'll give this one to Ronnie and Jason. Yeah, some of the things that are happening in New York, among other states, are in response to COVID, particularly long-term loss mitigation relief. They're really pushing the constitutional limits and potentially, state action dictating the terms of long-term loss mit as opposed to an agent agency and investor in the secondary market and investors dictating that, pushes constitutional limits. And so I guess the question that I have is, as lobbyists and then as lawyers, what works better, policy arguments or revenue arguments, or is it these legal arguments arguing that what you're about to do is unconstitutional? Do legislatures care if something is potentially preempted or unconstitutional?
No, when it comes to arguing before a legislature, and we've had clients that have engaged us to coordinate their governmental relations in all 50 states in the U.S. So I've been a registered lobbyist from California to Florida and DC and all over the place. And I can tell you the one thing that legislators never want to hear is, if you do this, this is unconstitutional. They recognize that they're one branch of the government. If it's unconstitutional, that's the prerogative of the court. What they want to do is pass a law, because whatever they pass is constitutional until it's declared unconstitutional by a court of law and becomes a final decision. Your strongest arguments are going to be policy arguments. The monetary aspects are important and make strong arguments, but that's something that you can kind of plant the seed and let legislators think about themselves, because in addition to the particular legislation that you're lobbying, they're also having to work on budgetary issues, and they're pretty sophisticated folks, and they're contemplating, well, gee, if we do this, this is going to cost the state this much money, how we're going to replace the revenue. But the real focus should be on the policy arguments. And you never know when what you're testifying before a legislature, how that can impact a court decision. I got a call from a lawyer in New Orleans that had told me that he had just won an important case, and that the judge found my testimony to be persuasive. And I told the guy, I said, wait, I wasn't even aware of this case. I didn't testify. I don't know what you're talking about. And he said, oh, you testified. You went before one of the legislative committees on such and such date and testified. I got a transcript of your testimony and attached that to what I filed with the court. And the judge read your testimony and was persuaded that that's the way that the law was intended to be, and that's the way the court ruled. So anyway, you always want to put good, strong policy arguments forth.
And to add to what Ronnie said in a very short way, my experience has been the first question they ask is, how much does this cost? And the last question they ask is it constitutional?
Yeah.
How much does this cost? How much is this going to take? How much money is this going to take away from my project and my district? That's the way they're looking at it when they ask that question.
We have about 10 minutes left. And so I guess what I want to do is I'm going to combine a couple of questions that I have and let each of you discuss them. So one of the things that in my mind that as an industry, when you're dealing with a legislature or policymakers, is you want to get a call before the law is passed so that you can provide your your input, whether or not it's ignored or it's taken into account and results in something better, even though that the law passes, or the executive order gets signed. What are things that our industry can be doing now so that when the legislative sessions return in January, that we're called in part of the upfront engagement? And then second, what are things that we should be doing long term to make sure that, whether it's involvement in trade associations or other community involvement, to ensure that we're part of those negotiations should COVID response be extended or in connection with the next emergency that may occur.
One thing I just want to touch upon, if it's okay, Jeff, is when you just mentioned trade associations play a very valuable role in the legislative process and the policy process, even with the executive branch. But one thing I've noticed over the years is many trade associations have combined with other trade associations to obtain the benefit of economies of scale. So the number of members of trade associations have increased. As the membership has increased, so have the divergent interests of the members. And it's not uncommon for me to go to reach out to a trade association to work with them on an issue, only to be told, well, we're monitoring this and reporting back to our people, but really can't take a position because we have one subset of our members who take this position and another subset who take this other position. And we just cannot formally lobby on this issue, which is deeply concerning to me. And it makes it more important for companies, especially companies that have sufficient size and scale, to have their own lobbyist on at least on standby for when those issues arise. Now, you don't have to enter into a full-blown engagement and have them on everything, because the trade associations do provide a very valuable resource the majority of the time. But I highly recommend that anyone who's doing business across the country have a legislative program that's not dependent upon the trade associations. And it's always good to have relationships, because it's much more difficult when you have an issue that either is of great importance to you before the legislature. It's much better to have entered into relationships with those legislators in advance of that issue, because if you go into them once the issue becomes an issue, you don't have that relationship, and they know you're only there because of that one issue. So it's really important to be proactive and ahead of when most people hit the panic button. You really need to be ahead of the curve.
Like, that reminds me, we have one client that was a major retail establishment that, without getting into all the details, it's basically they had a long-standing arrangement about how their alcohol sales were treated in the state. And they didn't have, as far as they didn't have any external lobbyists or government relations professionals watching out for this provision that they had, the protecting this provision. As far as I knew, no, they didn't have it. Well, lo and behold, the alcohol industry, which didn't like the fact that they had this provision, kind of came in one sleepy day in Judiciary Committee and just threw out this amendment. So, oh, this is just a cleanup amendment. This is not going to, impact anything. It's just been on the books for a long time, and we need to take it off. Well, so the committee just blew it by. Well, guess what? We got a call, a few months later? It's like, oh my God, what happened here? So we, won't get into the whole story, but they retained us to go in and try our best to have the provision restored. And at the end of the day, we worked out a good arrangement dealing with the governor's office and the entire legislature. It was an interesting experience, but it's a good story. It's a good example there of, it's always good to have not just trade associations, but your own government relations professionals on, they're looking out, always keeping an eye for your interests.
I'll add to that. And actually, I'll add to it from my former time in the inside. We were working on a major corporate tax reform bill that, was generally broad-based, industry overall loved, but there were many companies within these associations, the individual trades that were coming in that had these special business circumstances that the association just couldn't, they could not fix. They would not be able to, they just don't have the time to do it or the expertise to do it. So, I had companies coming into me on one-offs that we were just changing certain language so they wouldn't be hit with, one comes to mind, I won't mention who, but it was a $20 million tax bill, major retailer. No one thought of. We had utility trades coming in that were supporting of the bill, but individual utilities were saying, well, this is not how our operation works. So that's what's extremely important, to the extent you can have it, to have someone that's there for you. just because it adds an extra resource. And in these instances, I mean, it is saving companies tens of millions of dollars on a tax bill.
Yeah, and then going from the inside back to the outside. So, who are you interacting with in industry as government affairs professionals? Are you working with inside counsel? Are you working with dedicated government affairs professionals with organizations? And then do those interactions differ based on if you're working with in-house counsel versus government affairs?
So generally, for me, my day-to-day, it depends on the client. But for most of them, it's either in-house counsel or government affairs person. And then if it gets real technical on an operational side, they will bring whoever may be in their company in. But I'm always reporting to the government affairs person. However, on the procurement side, procurement's getting much bigger these days for these companies. I'm learning, there's a designated procurement salesperson that I deal with. So if it's legislative, regulatory, it's generally government affairs, in-house counsel. If it's procurement, it's whoever the head of the sales team is.
Yeah, and then what about at the McGlinchey folks? Who are you interacting with on
And usually, if there are established government relations in-house folks, we would probably hear or talk to them mostly. But there have been cases where they don't have dedicated government relations professionals, and it's been my experience that we deal with the general counsel at that level or above sometimes. But yeah, that's been again just matter. Like for instance, there's one client where they have an in-house governmental relations executive, but they're from out of state, and they have to deal with an issue here in state. They don't know anybody on the ground here, so they've reached out to us, and so that's a situation where we're working with their in-house government relations people to kind of guide them through the landscape and avoid any mines. And I think they definitely find that valuable, having people.
Yeah, and then
it's all about the relationships. It's all about like we've said here already.
Yeah, and then just anecdotally, do you find the relationship differs in how you interact with clients when you're dealing with lawyers versus folks with a policy legislative background?
I suppose it helps if they have a more policy and political antenna, I guess. That helps, at least in my case, helps me speak the same language. People who understand the process, who've worked like I have in state government, worked in politics campaigns too. Also campaign experience, which I've had plenty of, is very helpful. So yeah, when you get a little higher up on the chain than the pure government relations professional, you end up having to do a little, taking them to school sometimes on the process, and you see a lot of wide eyes sometimes. It's like, what? Which is kind of fun, but no, it doesn't have, dealing with the government relations executives can be a bit easier, I would say.
And Jeff, interestingly, some of the more interesting matters I probably handled or matters for companies that did not have anyone in-house that knew anything about lobbying. It was generally their in-house counsel or general counsel reaching out to one of our partners who are litigators saying, hey, we have this result, whether it's going to be a decision in a court decision, or maybe it's even something before an executive branch agency, and we want you to challenge that decision. And the litigator will reach out to us and talk to us about the statute and the history of the statute. And sometimes we've been able to say, well, look, the legislature's in session, we can drop a bill and fine tune the statute to clarify this and get you out of this court case, or have the executive branch decision be favorable to us as opposed to unfavorable. It's really an interesting process.
Yeah. So we have 1 minute left, and I just have. give each of you 10 seconds to kind of, give recommendations or, what you see coming down the pipeline, in the future.
Increased regulation.
Kevin in New York.
Increase taxes and regulation, get in front of policymakers, let them know the arguments ahead of time before it comes out and it's too late.
Thank you.
We'll see after November 3rd for sure.
Yeah. So to the audience, thank you so much for attending the session. Starting at 3:35 Eastern, you have 4 concurrent sessions to choose from. Available sessions will be on the session tab on the right side of your screen. You also have the option to join the session from the agenda page under the concurrent session tabs at the top. Thank you, everyone. And then thank you, Kevin, Ronnie, and Jason for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.